The Montana wind carried the scent of dust and desperation as it swept across the barren landscape surrounding Jake Morrison's ranch. It was October 1982, and the third consecutive year of drought had turned the once fertile plains into a canvas of cracked earth and withered grass. Jake stood on his weathered porch, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. At 53, he had spent more years alone than he cared to count, watching his dreams of family and prosperity fade like morning mist under the unforgiving sun. The ranch stretched before him like a monument to solitude, 2,000 acres of stubborn land that had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the original homestead with nothing but determination and raw muscle, and his father had expanded it into a thriving cattle operation. But Jake, despite his best efforts, had watched it slowly deteriorate since his wife Sarah's death 8 years ago. The cancer had taken her quickly, leaving him not just widowed, but utterly alone, with no children to carry on the Morrison name or to share the burden of keeping the ranch alive. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke through his melancholy thoughts. A battered pickup truck, its blue paint faded to an almost grey patina, kicked up a cloud of dust as it made its way down the long dirt road that led to his property. Jake squinted against the afternoon glare, not recognizing the vehicle. Visitors were rare out here, especially unannounced ones. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the small town of Cedar Ridge was a 40-minute drive through winding country roads. As the truck drew closer, Jake could make out 2 figures in the cab. The driver was a woman, her thin frame hunched over the steering wheel, and beside her sat what appeared to be a young girl. The truck wheezed to a stop near the porch, its engine coughing and sputtering before falling silent. The woman who emerged was probably in her 40s, though hard living had etched premature lines around her eyes and mouth. Her clothes were worn and patched, and her graying hair was pulled back in a messy bun that had seen better days. "You Jake Morrison?" she asked, her voice carrying a rasp that spoke of too many cigarettes and too little sleep. "That's me," Jake replied, setting down his coffee cup and stepping to the edge of the porch. "What can I do for you?" The woman glanced back at the truck, then at Jake, her eyes darting nervously. "Name's Betty Hawkins. I got a proposition for you." Jake's weathered face remained impassive, though something in the woman's manner set him on edge. "I'm listening." Betty walked to the passenger side of the truck and opened the door. "Come on, Emma. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." A young girl emerged from the truck and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. She couldn't have been more than 16, 17 at most, with long auburn hair that caught the sunlight and eyes the color of spring grass. But it was her condition that made Jake's heart skip. She was clearly pregnant, probably 6 or 7 months along, her small frame making her condition even more pronounced. The girl, Emma, kept her eyes downcast, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. She wore a simple cotton dress that had been let out to accommodate her pregnancy, and her worn sneakers were held together with duct tape. Despite her obvious poverty, there was something about her that struck Jake as almost ethereal, a quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her small frame. "This here's my daughter, Emma," Betty said, though her tone lacked any maternal warmth. "She's got herself in a family way and I can't afford to keep her. Hell, I can barely keep myself fed these days." Jake felt a knot forming in his stomach. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Hawkins?" Betty's eyes gleamed with a desperate cunning. "I heard you were looking for help around the ranch. Someone to cook, clean, that sort of thing. Emma's a good worker, knows her way around a kitchen and can handle most household chores. I'm willing to let her stay with you, work for her keep." "Let her stay?" Jake's voice carried a note of disbelief. "She's your daughter." "She's also a burden I can't afford," Betty snapped, her mask of reasonableness slipping. "Look, Morrison, I'll be straight with you. I need money and I need it now. My landlord's threatening eviction, and I haven't eaten a decent meal in 3 days. You take Emma off my hands, and I'll consider it a fair trade." Jake looked at Emma, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Her green eyes were filled with a pain that went far deeper than her obvious physical discomfort. When she finally looked up at him, he saw something that made his chest tighten. A flicker of hope mixed with resignation, as if she had learned not to expect kindness, but still harbored a small flame of faith that someone, somewhere, might prove her wrong. "Emma," Jake said gently, "do you want to stay here?" The girl's eyes widened at being addressed directly. She glanced at her mother, who shot her a warning look, then back at Jake. I don't have anywhere else to go, sir. The baby's father, he left when he found out. Said he wasn't ready to be tied down." Her voice was soft, musical, despite the weight of her circumstances. Jake could hear the exhaustion in it, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been carrying too heavy a burden for too long. "How far along are you?" Jake asked. 7 months, Emma replied, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "Doc says the baby's healthy, growing right on schedule." Betty shifted impatiently. "Look, Morrison, I don't have all day. You want her or not? I got other places I can try." Jake studied the woman's face and saw the lie in her eyes. There were no other places, no other options. This was desperation masquerading as business negotiation. "What kind of trade are we talking about?" he asked, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. Betty's face lit up with greedy satisfaction. "I saw you got a whole storehouse of supplies back there. Flour, canned goods, that sort of thing. I figure a 50-pound sack of flour would be fair compensation for taking Emma off my hands." The audacity of the proposal hit Jake like a physical blow. This woman was literally trying to sell her pregnant daughter for a bag of flour. His first instinct was to order them both off his property, but something in Emma's eyes stopped him. She was watching him with a mixture of hope and fear, as if she knew her entire future hung on his next words. "Mrs. Hawkins," Jake said slowly, "are you seriously asking me to trade a sack of flour for your daughter?" "I'm asking you to take responsibility for her," Betty shot back. "She's going to have that baby whether I'm around or not. At least here she'll have a roof over her head and regular meals. That's more than I can guarantee." Jake looked at Emma again, seeing the way her shoulders had sagged at her mother's words. The girl was barely more than a child herself, pregnant and abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. The thought of her being bartered like livestock made his stomach turn. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked Emma directly. "Yesterday morning," she replied quietly. "Mama had some crackers left." Jake's jaw tightened. He walked to the edge of the porch, his hands gripping the railing as he stared out at his empty fields. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, reminding him of the conversations they used to have about the children they'd never been able to have. The way she'd always said that sometimes God puts people in your path for a reason. "All right," he said finally, turning back to face them. "But I'm not buying anything from you, Mrs. Hawkins. I'm offering Emma a place to stay, a job if she wants it, and a chance to have her baby in safety. If you want to take that flower and leave, that's your choice. But I'm not party to any transaction that treats a human being like property." Betty's face flushed with anger. "You think you're better than me, Morrison. You think you can judge how I handle my own daughter." "I think," Jake said quietly, "that Emma deserves better than being traded for a bag of flour." Emma looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "You'd really let me stay? Even though I'm not married? Even though people will talk?" Jake felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "Emma, you're welcome here for as long as you need. The only thing I ask is that you take care of yourself and that baby." Betty grabbed the sack of flour Jake offered her with shaking hands, her face a mask of bitter resentment. "Don't come crying to me when you realize what you've gotten yourself into," she snarled. "That girl's nothing but trouble." Emma watched her mother drive away without looking back, her small body trembling with emotion. Jake stood beside her on the porch, both of them watching the dust cloud disappear into the distance. "She's not coming back, is she?" Emma asked softly. "I don't think so," Jake replied honestly. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing." Emma nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know I'm not much to look at right now, and I know this situation isn't conventional, but I promise you, Mr. Morrison, I'll work hard. I'll earn my keep." Jake turned to look at her, this young woman who had been abandoned by everyone who should have loved her, and felt something awakening in his heart that had been dormant for too long. "Emma, the first thing you need to understand is that you're not here to earn anything. You're here because you deserve a safe place to have your baby and figure out what comes next." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison realized that his lonely ranch was about to become something he'd never expected, a sanctuary for the lost and broken, starting with the brave young woman standing beside him, carrying new life in a world that had shown her precious little kindness. The first week of Emma's stay at the Morrison Ranch passed in a delicate dance of adjustment and unspoken understanding. Jake had given her the spare bedroom that had once been intended as a nursery, a room Sarah had painted a soft yellow years ago, hoping it would welcome either a son or daughter. The irony wasn't lost on him as he watched Emma arrange her few possessions on the dresser: a worn Bible, a small wooden jewelry box, and a photograph of herself as a young child, smiling beside a man Jake assumed was her father. "He died when I was 12, Emma explained quietly, noticing Jake's gaze lingering on the photograph. car accident on his way home from the mill. That's when everything started falling apart for Mama." Jake nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit about how loss could unravel a person's world. He'd seen it happen to himself after Sarah's death, the slow erosion of hope and purpose that came with grief. The difference was that Emma had been a child when her world collapsed, and instead of having time to heal, she'd been forced to grow up too quickly. The morning routine they'd established was simple but comforting. Jake would wake before dawn to tend to the livestock, the small herd of cattle that represented the last remnants of his family's legacy. When he returned to the house, Emma would have breakfast waiting. Eggs from the chickens she'd quickly befriended, coffee that was somehow always the perfect strength, and whatever she could manage from the pantry stores. She moved through the kitchen with a natural grace that spoke of years of necessity, her growing belly accommodated by the careful way she positioned herself at the counter and stove. "How you don't have to do all this," Jake had told her on the third morning, watching her expertly flip pancakes while humming softly under her breath. "I want to," Emma had replied, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised him. "I need to feel useful. I need to know I'm contributing something." What struck Jake most about Emma wasn't just her work ethic or her quiet dignity, it was her uncomplaining acceptance of her circumstances. She never spoke bitterly about her mother's abandonment or the baby's father's desertion. Instead, she seemed to channel all her energy into creating a sense of normalcy and purpose in her new environment. The town of Cedar Ridge, however, was less accepting of their arrangement. Jake had anticipated the gossip, but the reality of it was more intense than he'd expected. His weekly trip to Miller's general store for supplies became an exercise in enduring whispered conversations and pointed stares. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, had made her feelings clear the previous Saturday. "That girl can't be more than 16, Jake Morrison," she'd said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the other customers to hear. "What kind of man takes in a pregnant child and doesn't ask questions about where she came from?" Jake had paid for his supplies in silence, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. But it was Emma who surprised him most when he returned home and shared what had happened. "People are going to talk," she'd said matter-of-factly, looking up from the baby blanket she was knitting. "They always do when they don't understand something. But Mr. Morrison, you and I know the truth of what's happening here. That's what matters." Her composure and wisdom seemed far beyond her years, and Jake found himself wondering what experiences had taught her such grace under pressure. The answer came gradually, in fragments shared during their evening conversations on the porch, as the Montana sky painted itself in brilliant shades of purple and gold. Emma had been caring for her mother since her father's death, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to an adult. She'd learned to stretch $1 until it screamed, to make meals from whatever scraps were available, and to navigate the complex emotions of a parent who had given up hope. The pregnancy had been the final straw for Betty, not because of moral outrage, but because it represented another mouth to feed and another complication in an already impossible situation. "Tommy, that's the baby's father. He was the first person who ever made me feel special," Emma confided one evening, her hands resting on her belly. "He was older, had a job at the lumber mill, and he said he loved me. I was so hungry for someone to care about me that I believed everything he told me." Jake listened without judgment, recognizing the universal human need for love and acceptance that had led Emma to make choices that changed her life forever. He'd seen similar stories play out in small towns across the country, young women seeking love and finding abandonment, left to face the consequences alone. "Do you regret it?" he asked gently. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on the distant mountains. "I regret trusting him. I regret not seeing that he was using me, but I can't regret this baby. This little one is innocent in all of this, and they're going to be the first person in my life who I'll love completely and who'll love me back the same way." The depth of her maternal instinct, even before the baby's birth, moved Jake profoundly. He'd watched Sarah struggle with their inability to have children, seen the way she'd poured her frustrated maternal energy into caring for injured animals and neighbors in need. Emma's fierce protectiveness toward her unborn child reminded him of Sarah's strength and determination. As October faded into November, the first snows began to dust the mountains, and Emma's pregnancy progressed into its 8th month. Jake had insisted on taking her to Dr. Patterson in Cedar Ridge for regular checkups, enduring the disapproving stares of the waiting room to ensure both mother and baby remained healthy. "Everything looks perfect, Doctor," Patterson had assured them during the most recent visit. "The baby's in the right position. Heartbeat is strong and Emma's health is excellent. Though I do want to discuss where you plan to deliver, young lady." Emma had looked at Jake with uncertainty. They'd avoided discussing the practical details of the birth, both of them somehow afraid to make plans that might jinx the peaceful routine they'd established. "The hospital in Billings is the safest option," Dr. Patterson had continued. "It's about an hour-and-a-half drive, but they have everything we might need if there are complications." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, Jake broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Emma, after the baby comes, what are your plans?" She was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if she'd heard him. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I've been so focused on just getting through each day that I haven't let myself think about what comes next. I know I can't stay here forever, but I don't know where else to go." Jake felt his heart constrict. Over the past month, Emma had become an integral part of his daily life. The house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of cooking, humming, and the gentle conversation of someone who appreciated the simple rhythms of ranch life. The thought of returning to the silence and emptiness that had defined his existence for so many years felt unbearable. "What if I told you that you could stay?" he said carefully. "What if I told you that this place feels more like home than it has in years, and that's because you're here?" Emma turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Morrison, you don't understand what you're saying. People already talk about us. If I stay here with a baby, unmarried, the gossip will be terrible. It could ruin your reputation in town." "Emma," Jake said, his voice firm but gentle, "I'm 53 years old. I've lived my entire life in this county, and I've earned the right to make my own choices about who I share my home with. More importantly, I've learned that the opinions of people who judge without understanding aren't worth the breath it takes to discuss them." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of winter's approach. Emma pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her movements more careful now as her pregnancy advanced. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you want me to stay?" Jake was quiet for a moment, searching for words that could adequately express the transformation Emma had brought to his life. "Because," he said finally, "you've reminded me what it means to care about someone beyond myself. You've brought purpose back to this place and hope back to my life. That baby you're carrying is going to be born into a world that can be cruel and unforgiving. But here on this ranch, that child will be loved and protected and valued. That's worth more than all the gossip in Cedar Ridge." Emma began to cry then, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. "I've been so scared," she whispered. "So scared of being alone with a baby, of not being able to provide, of failing as a mother before I even start." Jake reached over and took her hand, surprised by how small and cold it felt in his weathered palm. "You're not alone, Emma, and you're going to be an amazing mother. I've watched you care for the chickens, tend to the garden, and bring life back to this old house. That baby is lucky to have you." As they sat together in the growing darkness, both of them felt the weight of an unspoken understanding. They were two people who had been abandoned by circumstance and loss, finding in each other a chance at the family they'd both given up hope of having. The arrangement was unconventional, certainly, but it was built on mutual respect, genuine care, and the shared recognition that sometimes the most unlikely combinations create the strongest bonds. The first snowflakes began to fall as they finally went inside, and Jake realized that winter's arrival no longer felt like a season to endure alone. This year, for the first time in 8 years, he was looking forward to the long, quiet months ahead, knowing that his house would be filled with the sounds of life and the promise of new beginnings. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it the kind of blizzard that old-timers in Cedar Ridge would talk about for years to come. The snow fell in thick, heavy curtains that transformed the Morrison Ranch into a winter wonderland, but also created a sense of isolation that pressed against the windows like a living thing. Jake had spent the morning reinforcing the barn doors and checking on the cattle, while Emma moved more slowly through her household routines, her pregnancy now so advanced that even simple tasks required careful planning and frequent rest. It was on December 15th, 3 days before what Dr. Patterson had calculated as Emma's due date, that everything changed. Jake was in the kitchen, attempting to cook dinner while Emma rested in the living room, when he heard her sharp intake of breath. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, one hand pressed against the wall for support, the other cradling her belly. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic, "I think it's time." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and growing concern. Jake had prepared for this moment. He'd studied the route to the hospital in Billings, kept the truck winterized and ready, and even practiced loading Emma's hospital bag into the vehicle. What he hadn't prepared for was the intensity of the blizzard that had been building all day, turning the mountain roads into treacherous passages that claimed even experienced drivers. "We need to go now," Emma said between contractions, her face pale but determined. "The pains are getting closer together." Jake helped her into the truck, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the blankets around her. The heater struggled against the cold, and the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the accumulating snow. As they made their way down the ranch road, Jake realized with growing dread that the main highway was barely visible beneath the snow, and the wind was creating drifts that threatened to swallow the truck entirely. They made it perhaps 15 miles before the inevitable happened. The truck slid sideways on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow, and despite Jake's best efforts to maintain control, they ended up in a ditch beside the road. The engine continued to run, but the wheels spun uselessly when Jake tried to back out of their predicament. "Oh God," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear as another contraction gripped her. "What are we going to do?" Jake forced himself to remain calm, though his mind was racing through increasingly desperate options. They were at least an hour from town in good weather, and with the blizzard intensifying, rescue was unlikely until morning. The truck's fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and running the engine all night to keep warm would be risky at best. "Emma," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "we're going to have to go back to the ranch. I can walk it in about an hour, maybe less. Then I'll come back for you with the tractor." "No." Emma's voice was sharp with panic. "The baby's coming too fast. I can feel it. Please don't leave me alone." Jake looked at her face, seeing the fear and pain etched in her features, and made a decision that would haunt and bless him for the rest of his life. "Okay," he said quietly. "Then we're going to deliver this baby right here." What followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Drawing on half-remembered conversations with the veterinarian who had helped deliver calves on the ranch, and guided by Emma's intuitive understanding of her own body, Jake found himself transformed from a lonely rancher into an unlikely midwife. The truck became their delivery room, with blankets and towels Jake had packed for the hospital, now serving a more immediate purpose. Emma's strength amazed him. Between contractions, she gave him instructions based on things she'd read in the pregnancy books Dr. Patterson had lent her. She guided him through the process with a composure that belied her age and circumstances, her voice steady even as her body worked to bring new life into the world. "I can see the head," Jake announced, his voice filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. "Emma, you're doing amazing, just a little more." The blizzard raged around them, but inside the truck, time seemed to move differently. Jake found himself thinking of Sarah, wishing she could be there to witness this miracle, to help guide Emma through the final moments of labor. But even as he mourned her absence, he felt her presence in the determination that filled him, the steady calm that allowed him to help bring this child safely into the world. At 11:47 p.m., with the wind howling outside and snow piling against the windows, Emma gave birth to a daughter. The baby's first cry pierced the storm, a sound so pure and strong that Jake felt tears streaming down his cheeks. Emma reached for her daughter with shaking hands, and Jake carefully placed the tiny bundle against her chest. "She's perfect," Emma whispered, her voice filled with exhausted joy. "She's absolutely perfect." Jake wrapped both mother and baby in every blanket he could find, his hands trembling as he tried to process what had just happened. In the span of a few hours, he had gone from being a bystander in Emma's journey to being the first person to hold this new life, to help her take her first breaths in a world that had seemed so cold and unwelcoming just hours before. "What will you name her?" he asked softly, watching as Emma studied her daughter's tiny features. "Grace," Emma said without hesitation. "Her name is Grace Morrison." Jake's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Morrison." Emma looked at him with eyes that held a depth of gratitude and love that took his breath away. "You delivered her, Mr. Morrison. You were the first person to hold her, to welcome her into this world. In every way that matters, you're her grandfather. If you'll have us, I'd like her to carry your name." The simple statement broke something open in Jake's chest, a dam of emotion that had been building since the moment Betty Hawkins had driven away months ago. This young woman, barely more than a child herself, was offering him something he'd never dared to hope for: a family, a legacy, a reason to believe in tomorrow. "I'd be honored," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. They spent the rest of the night huddled together in the truck, taking turns holding Grace and marveling at the miracle of her existence. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside their small sanctuary there was warmth and wonder, and the quiet joy of new life. When morning came, the snow had stopped falling, and the sun emerged to transform the landscape into a crystalline wonderland. Jake managed to flag down a snowplow that was clearing the roads, and within an hour they were at the hospital in Billings, where Dr. Patterson pronounced both mother and baby to be in excellent health. "I've delivered hundreds of babies," Dr. Patterson told Jake privately, "but I've never seen anything like this. That little girl was born under impossible circumstances, yet she's as healthy and strong as any baby I've ever examined. And Emma, she showed incredible courage and strength. You should be proud of both of them." Jake was proud, but more than that, he was transformed. The lonely rancher who had stood on his porch just 3 months ago, watching his dreams fade like morning mist, was gone. In his place stood a man with purpose, with family, with hope for the future. When they returned to the ranch 2 days later, Jake carried Grace while Emma walked slowly beside him, still recovering from the delivery. The house that had echoed with emptiness for so many years now rang with the sounds of new life. Grace's soft cries, Emma's gentle lullabies, and the quiet conversations of a family learning to be together. That evening, as they sat in the living room with Grace sleeping peacefully in a makeshift crib Jake had fashioned from a drawer and some soft blankets, Emma spoke the words that had been in both their hearts. "We're a family now, aren't we?" she said softly. Jake looked at this young woman who had arrived at his ranch as a commodity to be traded, who had become his daughter in every way that mattered, and at the baby who had been born in a blizzard and had somehow made them complete. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "We're a family." Outside, the Montana wind continued to blow across the ranch, but it no longer carried the scent of loneliness and desperation. Instead, it brought the promise of spring, of new beginnings, and of the miracle that had transformed 3 separate lives into something beautiful and whole. The girl who had been sold for a sack of flour had brought with her the greatest gift of all, the gift of love, family, and hope, reborn. And in the years that would follow, Jake Morrison would never cease to marvel at the miracle that had arrived on his doorstep, disguised as the most desperate of circumstances.